The night should have been filled with warmth, candles, and the soft chorus of birthday wishes. Instead, it ended with the slam of a door and the echo of betrayal. On her own birthday, the elder woman stood outside her family's home, shivering, in disbelief as the very people she had nurtured cast her out without mercy. Their laughter still spilled from inside, muffled by walls that once sheltered her sacrifices, now turned into barriers of cruelty. The sting was not just in the cold air biting at her skin, but in the humiliation of being discarded like a burden. Yet, in the silence of that dark night, something else stirred an unspoken resilience, a secret waiting to unravel. For a while, they believed they had stripped her of dignity. Fate had already begun to turn. A lawyer's knock at midnight would reveal that this story was far from over. There was a time when her birthday had been a season of light, not shadow. The day was once marked by the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house, balloons tied hastily to chairs, and the aroma of a cake she had always insisted on baking herself. She remembered the glint of candles reflected in young, eager eyes, the way her family leaned in close, singing with genuine affection. Each hug, each gift, each word of gratitude had been proof that her sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. In those years, her birthday wasn't just about her age. It was about everything she symbolized. She was the center of the family's orbit, the one who kept everyone together. Her hands had stitched clothes, cooked meals, and healed wounds both visible and invisible. When they lifted their glasses in a toast, it wasn't just to another year of her life, but to the life she had given them all. She recalled one particular birthday when her grandchildren, barely able to spell, handed her cards filled with crooked letters and crayon hearts. Their small voices had shouted, "We love you, Grandma," and her heart had nearly burst with joy. On that day she had felt irreplaceable, a cornerstone in the foundation of their happiness. But time, with its quiet cruelty, began to erode that warmth. The candles still flickered, the cake still appeared, but the glances across the table grew distracted. Phones buzzed where conversations once lingered. Laughter became forced, more out of habit than sincerity. When she spoke, her words were drowned beneath side chatter, as though her voice no longer carried weight. Small changes became undeniable signs. Once, they used to surprise her with songs and stories of appreciation. Later, they reduced her birthdays to brief acknowledgments, a perfunctory happy birthday as they turned back to their own conversations. The cards disappeared, replaced by hurriedly bought gifts with no thought, or sometimes no gift at all. She began to notice the impatience in their eyes when she shared old tale stories of resilience. Stories of how she had endured so they could thrive. Where there had once been admiration, now there was mockery disguised as humor. "We've heard this before," they would say, rolling their eyes. Even on her birthday, her words seemed like unwelcome interruptions. The living room, which once buzzed with warmth on that special day, grew colder year by year. She was shifted further from the center of attention, her chair placed at the edge of gatherings rather than at the heart. Conversations passed over her like a forgotten ornament on the mantel, and so her birthdays transformed from cherished celebrations into reminders of loss, not the loss of years, but the loss of love, respect, and gratitude. She smiled through it all, clutching fragments of past joy, but deep inside, she knew the truth. The day that once honored her existence now magnified her invisibility. It was this slow unraveling, this gradual betrayal that made the final act of being thrown out on her birthday all the more devastating. The contrast was unbearable. From cherished matriarch to discarded elder, from joyous center to forgotten shadow. Yet within that sorrow lay the seed of reckoning they never saw coming. It began not with outright cruelty, but with small gestures, so subtle that at first she dismissed them as thoughtless mistakes. A cousin would casually park his new car in her driveway and joke, "One day this will be mine anyway." A niece wandered through her sitting room, running her fingers along the old oak cabinet. whispering to another, "Imagine how much this antique could sell for." They laughed as though it were harmless banter, but to her every word carried the weight of disregard. Her home, once sacred as the heart of family gatherings, began to feel less like her sanctuary and more like a showroom for their ambition. She overheard discussions not about her well-being, but about what would happen when she's gone. A nephew once asked, not shyly, but boldly, "Do you really need all these rooms? It's too big for just one person. Maybe you should think about handing it down early." Even the objects that held memories that China She had saved for decades. The embroidered cloth her mother had left became targets of mockery. "These old things are just clutter," a granddaughter sneered, rolling her eyes. "You don't seriously expect us to keep this stuff, do you?" They laughed, unaware that every item dismissed so easily was tied to a story. A sacrifice, a piece of her history. Their arrogance showed not only in words but in behavior. They stopped asking permission to take small things. A book vanished. Here, a piece of jewelry there, always excused as borrowing. One nephew even boasted at a party, "I'll be inheriting the silver soon enough," while others nodded, treating it like an amusing inevitability. No one noticed the way her hands tightened in her lap or how her smile faltered, as if each remark chipped away at the foundation of respect she had once commanded. The mockery grew sharper with time. They laughed at her habits of saving ribbons and reusing jars, calling her stingy and old-fashioned. What they could not see was that these habits were born of survival, not stubbornness. Each jar, each carefully folded bag was a quiet testament to the decades she had endured with discipline and foresight. But to them, it was nothing more than an eccentric quirk, something to ridicule when they thought she couldn't hear. Family traditions, once woven carefully by her hands, were brushed aside. She tried to share her recipes to keep alive the meals that had sustained them in leaner years, but they mocked the dishes as outdated. "No one eats like this anymore," a granddaughter complained, pushing away her plate. The rituals of holidays and birthdays once filled with reverence were reduced to background noise. Her role as matriarch, once unshakable, was quietly stripped from her dot. In the silence of her own home, she began to feel like a guest. Their eyes no longer looked at her with respect, but with calculation measuring her belongings, her space, even her presence. As though she were already gone, it was in those subtle shifts, those careless jokes and dismissive tones, that the early signs of greed revealed themselves. Not with fire and fury, but with quiet corrosion, the kind that eats away slowly until one day the whole foundation crumbles. Long before whispers of inheritance poisoned her family's hearts, there was a woman whose hands had built everything they now took for granted. Her story was not one of ease, but of relentless toil, nights of exhaustion, and mornings that began before the sun itself. She had known hunger and cold, yet she never allowed them to devour her children. Instead, she wore hardship like armor and transformed scarcity into survival. When she was young, she worked jobs no one else wanted, cleaning offices after hours, stitching clothes by candlelight, scrubbing floors until her fingers cracked. She endured it all. Every coin earned was stretched, every penny saved with care, while her peers bought small luxuries. She tucked her earnings into envelopes hidden away, teaching herself that sacrifice today meant security tomorrow. The home she lived in now, the one her relatives claimed as their own, had been purchased, brick by brick, through her discipline. Her sacrifices were not only financial but personal. She went without new clothes so her children could wear theirs proudly. She walked miles to work, her shoes worn thin, while saving bus fare for their school supplies. There were nights she skipped meals so her little ones could have second helpings. Mornings when she rose before dawn to mend clothes that would otherwise have fallen apart. Every wrinkle on her face, every callus on her palms, told the story of battles fought in silence and victories won in persistence. The symbolism of her resilience was everywhere, if only her family had cared to look. The jars lined neatly in her pantry were not clutter. but reminders of winters when she preserved food to outlast scarcity. The folded fabrics and mended linens were not scraps, but proof of resourcefulness that kept her home dignified when others would have given in too. Despair. Even the house itself bore the imprint of her labor walls painted with her own hands. A garden once lush with vegetables that had sustained her family through lean years. Yet, despite all this, her family saw only an old woman. They dismissed her as powerless, a relic of another time. They mocked the very habits that had kept them alive. In their arrogance, they believed her sacrifices had left her with nothing. They mistook humility for emptiness, silence for weakness, but they were wrong. What they could not see, what she never flaunted, was that her sacrifices had been more than survival. They had been investment, okay? Each act of frugality, each coin hidden away, had been part of a plan she never abandoned, even when it seemed impossible. Over the decades, her careful discipline had quietly grown into something far greater than her family could imagine. Suspense lingered in the air. It's unspoken but undeniable. Why did her family, blind in their greed, believe she was powerless? Perhaps it was because she never boasted, never demanded recognition. Perhaps it was because she let them laugh, let them sneer, never correcting their false assumptions. Or perhaps it was because she carried her strength like a secret, one she intended to reveal only when the moment was right. Her story was not merely one of sacrifice, but of foresight. She had lived a life that taught her storms always pass, but only for those who prepare. And she had prepared. In silence, in shadows, she had built more than a life. She had built an unshakable foundation. The irony was sharp. The very people who dismissed her as weak stood upon ground she had laid with her own unyielding hands. The suspense of her silence grew heavier with each passing day. They believed she had nothing left. Soon they would discover how wrong they were. The day that should have been filled with joy began with the soft glow of candles and the faint scent of flowers, but the warmth was a cruel illusion. It was her birthday, a day once celebrated with laughter, embraces, and gratitude. Yet this year, the house she had built with her own hands felt like a stage for betrayal. She entered the living room slowly, her steps unsteady but her eyes bright with quiet hope. On the table sat a small cake she had bought for herself, its single candle flickering timidly against the afternoon light. She had waited for voices of affection, for hands to reach out and honor the years of sacrifice she had given. But instead, the room grew cold with words sharp enough to slice deeper than any blade. "You can't stay here anymore," her eldest relative announced, voice stern, as though delivering a verdict. Another chimed in, "This house isn't yours alone. It's time you faced reality." The phrases landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. There was no softness in their tone, no acknowledgement of the life she had poured into those. Walls dot, she stood silently, hands folded, her frail frame framed by the window's light. Her eyes searched their faces she had once cradled as infants, guided through hardship, comforted in fear. Now those same faces were hardened with greed, their smiles twisted with arrogance. "Why drag it out?" a niece sneered. "You've lived long enough here. Should be grateful we're letting you go without a fight." Laughter followed, brittle and mocking, as if cruelty had become entertainment. Her birthday, once a symbol of love, had been transformed into a spectacle of humiliation. The cruelty was not just in their words, but in their actions. They gathered her belongings into boxes, carelessly tossing aside what she had treasured. Photographs crumpled, mementos discarded, heirlooms treated like junk. To them, she was no longer the matriarch, but a burden standing in the way of their entitlement. And yet, mid their noise, she did not weep. She did not shout, nor did she beg. Instead, she held herself with quiet dignity, her silence louder than their arrogance. Her eyes did not plead for mercy, but shimmered with an unspoken truth. She had endured worse storms, and she would endure this too. The contrast was striking, her calm against their chaos, her grace against their greed. Even as they declared her eviction, she stood as if she were the one allowing them to speak, granting them the stage to reveal the full measure of their cruelty. When the moment reached its peak, one nephew lit the candle on her small cake, mockingly. "Happy birthday," he sneered, blowing it out before she could make a wish. The gesture, meant to wound, only deepened the silence she carried. They thought they had stripped her of everything, leaving her powerless in the ruins of humiliation. But within that silence lay a strength none of them could comprehend. For every insult, every act of betrayal only sharpened the edge of her resolve. What they mistook for surrender was patience. What they saw as weakness was foresight. As the boxes piled higher and the family's voices grew louder, the elder woman stood at the heart of her own, betrayal, broken, unbowed. They had chosen her birthday, the day of her life's celebration, to declare her unworthy. Yet, in doing so, they had written the prelude to their downfall. For even as they mocked her, the clock ticked steadily toward midnight, toward the moment when a knock on the door would shatter their arrogance and her true strength would finally be revealed. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud, its echo chasing her into the night. She stood for a moment on the porch, clutching the small bag they had begrudgingly allowed her to take. Inside it were only fragments of a life-and-old photograph, a folded shawl, a worn Bible, everything else. The home she had built through sweat and sacrifice now belonged to those who had cast her out. It was her birthday, yet she walked away as though mourning a funeral, the death of love, the burial of respect. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath her frail steps. The street lamps glowed faintly, stretching long shadows across the road, painting her solitary figure in tones of melancholy. Her heart ached with every step, not just from the weight of betrayal, but from the memories tied to each corner of that neighborhood. She remembered children playing by fences, the laughter that once spilled from her windows, the times neighbors waved with kindness in their eyes. Now all of it felt distant, like a dream slipping into mist. Curtains fluttered as she passed, eyes peering from behind the glass. Some whispered in hushed tones, their faces marked with pity. "Poor woman," one murmured, shaking her head. "Thrown out on her own birthday." Another voice, sharp and dismissive, followed. "Well, maybe she brought it on herself. Families don't do this without a reason." The words stung, not because she believed them, but because betrayal often finds companions in gossip. Others dared to step outside. A neighbor she had once helped with food in lean times crossed her arms, avoiding eye contact. Another man smirked, muttering to his companion, "So much for her pride." Look at her now, walking with nothing. Their cruelty was a mirror of tease. As a mirror of her family's arrogance, proof that weakness often invites mockery, while quiet strength goes unseen. Yet, amid the whispers and judgment, there were softer glances too. A child tugged at his mother's hand, asking innocently, "Why is Grandma walking alone?" "It's her birthday." The mother's eyes welled with tears as she hushed him, guilt pressing down like the night air. A kind woman on the corner offered a nod, her gaze filled with sorrow. Though words failed her, the elder walked on, her head neither bowed nor raised too high. She carried herself with a dignity that the cold air could not strip away. Inside, her heart bled with grief. She had given everything to her family, only to be discarded as if her love were worthless. But beneath the sorrow, a spark of resilience glimmered. They believed they had taken everything, yet she knew they could not touch the one thing she carried within, her unbroken spirit. Every step became symbolica march through humiliation. Also a quiet defiance. Her shawl flapped in the wind like a banner, not of defeat, but of endurance. She was not walking away empty-handed. She was walking away with memories that could not be stolen, with wisdom that could not be mocked into dust. The home might have been lost, but her story, her sacrifices, Her hidden strength remained hers alone. By the time she reached the end of the street, the whispers had faded into the night. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. Her path was cold and lonely, but it was her own. And though her family believed they had exiled her into silence, each step she took was a vow, a promise that their cruelty would not be the final chapter. The night stretched before her, fast and unyielding, but so too did her resolve. What began as a walk of loneliness was already turning into the quiet journey of resilience. They had evicted her, humiliated her, and sent her into the darkness. Yet in truth, they had only set her on the road to a reckoning that none of them could foresee. Long before betrayal ever crossed her doorstep, the elder had understood one simple truth. People change, and even love can sour when greed takes root. She had seen enough in her lifetime: neighbors turned enemies over land disputes, siblings estranged over inheritance. Quietly, she promised herself she would never be left unprotected. No matter how much affection her family seemed to shower upon her in earlier years, behind her calm demeanor was a woman of foresight. While her children and relatives laughed at her frugality, mocking her for saving every receipt and filing away every letter, she was carefully weaving a shield of preparation. Every document, every signature, every small investment was part of a plan they could not see. She knew that appearances could be deceiving. Let them think she was weak, powerless, dependent. In truth, her strength lay hidden in the quiet corners of bank vaults and legal files. Tucked away in a worn leather folder were deeds and titles they never knew existed. The very house they thought they owned outright was safeguarded by clauses she had insured years earlier. When they were too blinded by comfort to notice her visits to the lawyer's office, in safety deposit boxes rested bonds, savings, and letters signed with seals that bore the weight of authority. She had stitched together a quiet empire, not of castles or jewels, but of resilience and independence. Her lawyer, a discreet man she trusted for decades, had often asked her, "You sure you want to keep this hidden?" She had only smiled, her eyes carrying the wisdom of patience. "The truth," she said, "is most powerful when revealed at the right moment." And so, while her relatives plotted, whispered, and stripped her of dignity, she allowed them to play their game. Their arrogance made them blind. Their entitlement deafened them to the silence of her preparation. Each cruel word, each dismissal only strengthened her resolve to let them walk deeper into the trap of their own making. The documents were more than legal protections. They were symbols of her resilience. Every page carried the story of her sacrifices, the long nights she had worked, the pennies she had saved, the opportunities she had denied herself so her children could thrive. They believed she had nothing left, but in reality, she had carefully preserved everything that truly mattered now as she carried herself through the aftermath of betrayal. The folder of secrets waited like a torch in the darkness. The suspense was no longer whether she had strength, but when she would unveil it. She did not rush. True power requires patience. Her family thought they had exiled her into despair. In reality, she stood at the edge of revelation. The night would not remain silent forever. Soon, the documents, the truth, and her dignity would speak louder than any insult ever thrown her way. The house was alive with laughter that night, though its echoes were hollow. The relatives had gathered in the living room, toasting their so-called victory. Convinced they had finally rid themselves of the burden they believed the elder had become. Glasses clinked, arrogance spilled from every corner, and whispers of new plans filled the air. What to sell first, how to divide the property, which luxury they would buy with their newfound freedom. They celebrated while the elders sat elsewhere in silence, her absence barely noticed, her dignity already dismissed in their eyes. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, a knock shattered the air. 3 sharp raps against the door silenced the laughter in an instant. Confused glances were exchanged. Irritation flashed across faces. Who could be calling at such an hour? Slowly, reluctantly, the eldest relative opened the door. There stood a man in a dark overcoat, his briefcase gleaming faintly in the porch light, his presence carrying the weight of authority. It was the lawyer. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his calm gaze sweeping across the smug faces gathered in the room. "Good evening," he said firmly, his voice steady yet sharp enough to slice through the tension. "I believe we have urgent matters to discuss." Murmurs rippled through the family, their arrogance wavering. Some tried to laugh it off, others frowned in suspicion. The lawyer opened his briefcase and placed a stack of documents neatly on the table. One by one, he laid them out, the sound of paper against wood ringing louder than any toast. Titles, deeds, contracts, proof of ownership, all bearing the elder's name. "This house," he declared, his finger resting on the bold signature, "was never yours to claim. It remains solely under her authority. Every room, every corner, every brick is tied legally to her name. Your eviction attempt was not only cruel, it was unlawful." The room froze. Their smirks collapsed into pale shock. Their laughter turned to stunned silence. The very walls they believed had become theirs now stood as a fortress around the elder. A fortress they had tried to storm with arrogance, only to be thrown back by truth. The lawyer wasn't finished. He revealed bank statements, figures that made their eyes widen. Fortunes built patiently over decades. Fretments, savings, bonds, all protected, all untouchable. The elder, whom they mocked as penniless and powerless, was in truth the wealthiest soul in the room. Humiliation spread like wildfire. Some relatives stammered in disbelief, others attempted weak protests, but the lawyer's voice silenced them every time. "You dismissed her as fragile," he said coldly, "but what you saw as weakness was her restraint. What you mistook for silence was her strength." In the corner of the room, the elder finally stepped forward, her face calm, her eyes resolute. She said nothing, letting the weight of the documents speak for her. Her quiet dignity stood taller than any words could. While her relatives drowned in the shame of their greed, the midnight air outside was still. But inside the house a storm raged, arrogance shattered, betrayal exposed, and truth unveiled. Celebration had turned into a courtroom, the laughter into stunned silence. The victors into the humiliated. That night marked a turning point. No longer was she the burden they cast aside. She was the rightful guardian of the home, the architect of her own resilience, and the keeper of a fortune they never deserved to touch. Midnight had brought them the truth, and the truth had crushed their pride. When the silence finally settled after the lawyer's departure, the elder remained composed, her heart heavy but steady. She had not sought this moment for vengeance. Rather, it had been the natural unfolding of truth. For years, she had lived, with patience, watching the slow erosion of respect, the cracks of greed widening in her family. Tonight's revelation was not a victory born of pride. 'Twas the reckoning she had quietly prepared for as she sat alone later that night. She reflected on the deeper meaning of what had transpired. Money, she knew, was never the essence of wealth. Wealth was foresight, the discipline to prepare for storms long before the clouds appeared. Wealth was dignity, the unshakable strength to endure humiliation without becoming bitter. Wealth was patience, the wisdom to wait until arrogance exposed itself. Until time delivered justice without her needing to shout, her thoughts drifted to the younger ones, those who had watched silently as their elders mocked her. Not all had joined in the cruelty. Some had lowered their eyes in shame, others had whispered apologies in private. These were the ones who now came to her side, their voices trembling as they confessed regret. Their reconciliation felt genuine, born not from the sight of wealth, but from recognition of her quiet strength. And then there were the others, the greedy, the arrogant, the ones who had led the betrayal. They avoided her gaze, their bravado dissolved. their arrogance exposed as nothing more than hunger for what was never theirs. They whispered excuses, blaming circumstances, pretending ignorance. Yet the truth was unshakable. They had chosen selfishness over love, entitlement over respect. Their isolation was no punishment she imposed. It was the natural consequence of their own actions. The elder felt no triumph in their downfall. Instead, she felt a quiet sorrow, for betrayal always leaves scars, even when justice is served. But she also felt a renewed sense of peace. Her legacy, she realized, was not only the documents safeguarded in banks or the deeds preserved in files. Her true legacy was the lesson her story would teach, that arrogance blinds. But wisdom outlasts cruelty. She resolved to nurture the bonds that remained sincere. The supportive relatives who had shown compassion, however small, were welcomed back into her heart. With them, she shared meals, stories, and gentle laughter. She taught them not just through words, but through her example, that dignity in suffering is more powerful than revenge, that patience carries more strength than anger, and that true wealth lies not in what one owns, but in how one endures. For the arrogant ones, their distance grew with time. Their isolation was a mirror they could not escape. And perhaps, she thought, that too was part of the lesson, that those who choose betrayal inevitably lock themselves outside the warmth of love and respect. In her reflections, the elder did not dwell on the cruelty of that birthday night. Instead, she embraced the deeper truth. They had tried to strip her of everything, yet in doing so, they only revealed the depth of her strength. The reckoning had not been about exposing her fortune, but about restoring her dignity in the face of those who had forgotten it, and so she carried forward not with bitterness, but with serenity, for she had shown them, all the family, the community, and even herself, that true wealth is not measured in possessions, but in the unyielding resilience of a soul that refuses to be broken. On that birthday night, when the cruel words were spoken and the door was shut on her, it seemed as though everything had been taken away. To the watching neighbors and mocking relatives, the scene was simple: an elder, powerless, cast aside in humiliation. Yet what they did not see was the quiet fire within her, the patience of decades, and the foresight of someone who had weathered storms far harsher than the scorn of ungrateful kin. They thought they had evicted her from her own home, but the truth was far more profound. By their greed, by their arrogance, they had evicted themselves from her trust, from her respect, and ultimately from her legacy. What they sought to steal crumbled in their grasp, while what she preserved in silence stood unshakable. The midnight knock of the lawyer was not just the unveiling of documents. It was the sound of justice, the echo of dignity reclaimed. Her life, in the end, was not defined by the betrayal of that birthday, but by the strength with which she rose above it. Her wealth, though immense, was never the true revelation. The true revelation was resilience, that quiet endurance that turns humiliation into triumph, that transforms cruelty into a lesson. As the family scattered into their respective corners, some humbled, some bitter, she remained steady, for she understood what many failed to grasp. Arrogance is fleeting, like smoke carried away by the wind, but resilience endures. Leaving a mark deeper than stone, the story closed not with bitterness, but with empowerment. She had not only secured her home and her fortune, she had secured her dignity, her place, and her peace. And in doing so, she left behind a truth too powerful to ignore. Those who betray may win moments, but those who endure win legacies. Her birthday, once marred by cruelty, became a testament. They tried to erase her, but she became unforgettable. They tried to take everything, but she took back more than they ever imagined. And in the end, her resilience proved to be the greatest gift of all.